Hello, Steve. Welcome back to the show for the third time. A rare hat trick.
Hello, Lian. Thanks for having me back.
Well, we've now been talking for, I think, almost an hour without recording, working our way to the point of actually having a topic to talk about. And as you know, this started by me sharing a list of things that had been kind of in my awareness, have been of interest to me. And one of the things on that list was neurodivergence. And we've just been kind of pretty much all around the houses talk about all sorts of other things. And then I've come back to the point where that was the one that stood out to you most on that list of things that have been arising for me as something that you were curious about, but you made... he was saying it isn't really so much the topic in general, but you just felt that you wanted to ask more about my own experience. And initially I was like, hell no, Steve, that just gives you the excuse to keep asking me questions and me not ask you questions, which has been somewhat of a pattern. You look pained at this point. Is that not your recollection?
It's a very different event. Yeah, you send a list of very interesting topics, and that stood out to me, in a way, because I know you have an interesting, I suppose, history with neurodivergence. You yourself recently, you told me, were relatively recently diagnosed with autism, and you found that to be very useful diagnosis. The other topics were also very fascinating, but I think they lacked a jumping off point from your point of view. You didn't have anything really you wanted to say about it. They're just an interesting topic. And I think that's, in this case of neurodivergence, it's not really my area of expertise, I must say. But I'm always interested in a good story, a good case study. So, tell me if you would then about your own experience in that field. What does neurodivergence mean to you? And can you perhaps tell a little bit about your story of your diagnosis and why that was significant? And I know there's some family history there also. Whatever feels interesting.
So, just to say, and I'll probably say this when I actually come to record the formal intro at the end, or after we've done this. I'm going to basically submit to you asking me a lot of questions, and I may ask you questions in return, but this will probably be quite a different show to normal, and I'm just going to roll with that. So you've asked me a lot of questions in one there, so I'm just going to...
I perhaps ought to add this pattern of me asking you questions. I don't know if that's really true with the previous episodes, but in the absence of anything coming this way, in the absence of something coming this way, all I can do is resort to questions. I don't know. I have a soapbox on the subjects that were listed, but I do like to ask questions. Yeah, it's true. I do that a lot on my own podcast, Guru Viking Podcast, and it's a natural home place for me, actually. So yeah, if all else fails, you can always count on me to ask questions. That's for sure. So please, go ahead then.
So it feels like you asked me 5 questions in one. So I'm going to pick one of them. I think was something like, what does neurodivergence mean to me? Because that in itself has been a journey of maybe not a lifetime, but quite a number of years. And my experience of that and my views on that have radically changed. So my first sense of neurodivergence, although I wouldn't have used the word then, was when I was quite young, realizing that the way that my mind experienced numbers certainly wasn't anything like my father seemed to. But I also started to recognize, like, this seems out of sync with other places. Like, I've kind of can understand how my mind handles things, and then when it comes to numbers, it seems to be doing something very different with numbers. And this was, I guess, more stark because my father was incredibly gifted when it comes to numbers. He was at one point taught maths and physics at secondary school, so it was something that for him came really naturally. And then I'd realized, like, I don't even seem to have like an average ability of maths. I seem to just have this really odd relationship where numbers just don't seem to be able to sit somewhere neatly in my head. And I would make lots and lots of mistakes when it came to anything involving times and dates and things like that. So, and it was so obvious. I didn't feel like it was just this kind of like, oh, I struggle a bit with maths. I knew there was something different there. And then I came across the term dyscalculia, which is a kind of version of dyslexia, but with numbers. And immediately, as soon as I saw that described, I was like, oh, that's what's going on here. And there was a real sense of relief in just like, that's what it is. No, I don't have a problem with that. It doesn't really mean anything about me. It just explains the experience that I've been having and gives a name to it that kind of I can sort of just, it just sits neatly with that. And then I don't need to do anything more with it. So that was my first experience of recognizing that I could be called. And again, I don't think the term necessarily was in my awareness then, but that was a kind of my first experience of having some sense of being neurodivergent. And then as the years went by, there were other types of neurodivergences that were coming into my awareness where, and some of these are personal to other people, so I can't kind of give too much detail, but a close family member was being kind of investigated for dyspraxia. And it was a very similar situation where I was like, oh, that explains so much about why I can really struggle with some kind of motor skills and organization and things like that. And so it was another one of those ones like, oh, well, that would explain a lot. Maybe I didn't have a real attachment to that. It wasn't quite as clear cut as with dyscalculia, but it's like, oh, maybe I'm dyspraxic as well. And then I think ADHD came into my awareness. And again, it was like a kind of like, that would explain some things. And I could go into a bit more detail in terms of like the types of things that were going on for me that would explain this. But I'm just really, again, my journey with neurodivergence has actually been quite a number of different things showing up over the years. And then when I met Jonathan, the co-founder of Primal Happiness, quite soon into our relationship, he started saying to me, you're on the spectrum, aren't you? And I was just like, no, like, I'm really not. And of course, you know, for so many people, we have a very kind of stereotypical view of what being autistic might be. And, you know, the kind of extreme of that would be something like Rain Man. And it would be very male, a very specific way it shows up. And I was just like, yeah, it doesn't make sense to me. Although there's some aspects that I could kind of make fit, overall, it just doesn't seem as though, it certainly wasn't anything like that kind of immediate recognition I had with the dyscalculia. So that was my first reaction. And then over the years, I think as more things became talked about in terms of the way that autism shows up in women, it started to become more and more like, oh, this is becoming like a little bit harder now to just completely dismiss. And it wasn't that I had any sort of like, oh, that's offensive, or I really don't want to be. It was more just, it didn't feel true. And then it started to feel like, that would explain some things. And fast forwarding to a year or so ago, we had a client who had quite similar traits to me. And he was also saying about her, she's on the spectrum. She was then diagnosed as being on the spectrum. And I was just like, oh God, if he was right about her, perhaps he is right about me, and then started to take it more seriously. So I can say a bit more again about all of the details behind that. But in general, I've got to the point now, having had an autism diagnosis, and then started to recognize that actually that doesn't still completely explain all these other neurodivergences. So I either have like almost like a full set of neurodivergences, or perhaps our just understanding of there being these like defined different neurodivergences, perhaps that's not quite depending on the level we're looking at it, perhaps, and in some ways that can be helpful, but perhaps that's not really the deeper truth that's here when we're talking about neurodivergence. And then, just to add a further complication to this, and I'll let you ask me another question on it. More and more, and this is quite controversial to say, particularly in kind of like autistic circles, more and more, I just wonder whether there is just a whole spectrum of neurotypes, and there's a kind of more typical end of that spectrum and a more divergent and kind of a perhaps like rarer end of that spectrum, but that's just a human spectrum. That more and more feels to me that it has truth and has it more matches what I'm experiencing and also seeing in others. So that's me on neurodivergence.
That's very interesting. What's controversial about that view you've expressed there? You've said that this spectrum of neurodiversities, maybe it's just that, you've said. I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on the implications of what you said and why that might be considered controversial in some circles. You mentioned within the autism community.
So, and I think, just to be clear, I'm not in any way dismissing the controversy or saying there isn't good reason for what I'm about to say what I have been saying for it being controversial. I think there's something there to be honoured too. But the reason for this is what a number of autistic people have said to them when they're, for example, sharing the fact that they've had a diagnosis or are suspecting that they're autistic. A common thing that is said, apparently it's never actually been said to me, but a common thing that's said apparently is, oh, well, aren't we all on that spectrum, or aren't we all on a spectrum? And it can land, particularly if you've been someone who's had been challenged a lot by those traits, that can be very, I guess, dismissive, is in, well, we all have those traits. We just, some of them have more than others. Therefore, it's no big deal. Therefore, the label itself really doesn't have any value. And of course, that in itself is a whole nother question. There's, in some ways it is helpful, some ways it isn't. But for someone who doesn't have that experience to tell the other person your experience is really quite meaningless and is actually shared by all of us, that can have both, personal implications, but also in terms of the overall, if there is a point for naming these things and understanding them, that has deeper implications there too. Is really sort of saying, okay, none of this even exists, which is, begging deeper questions.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. Why do you think that people react that way? Do you think it's because the word spectrum, the misunderstanding of what's meant by that? The idea, well, it's a spectrum, so, people may misunderstand what that means and say, well, aren't we all on the spectrum? Isn't that what a spectrum is? They may not understand what's meant by spectrum in that case. Or is it ignorance? Is it their own discomfort? What do you think, or an attempt to comfort the person, perhaps ill-foundedly? What do you think comes? Where's that coming from? That common response that you've described of saying, "Well, aren't we all on the spectrum after all?"
That's a really good question, and I've pondered that myself, and I think it's likely a mix of all the things you've said. I think there's a kind of empathic urge to feel as though, like, oh, I get it, me too. I think there's that at play. I think, yes, there's likely just a misunderstanding of what's meant by spectrum, as in, again, we're all on a spectrum of being human. And so I think there can be this sense of like, well, yes, we are all on the spectrum. And I think there is also, how can I put this? A bit of a I guess it can feel threatening to have someone say that these particular things make me a certain way, and therefore can be considered in like, therefore that means I require special treatment, or I require this from you. And so I wonder also if it can come across as threatening, and therefore the person who's saying, kind of, we're on the spectrum, almost like, you're not special, we all have a bit of that. So they're not then having to provide whatever they believe is being asked. I wonder if there is and that's happening at a kind of such a subconscious level. I don't think any of that's actually conscious, but I wonder if there is a bit of that at play too.
Oh, I see. They're trying to fit what they're hearing into a map they can understand, that they can respond to reduce the stress of being taken out of what they know, how they know how to respond. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. What is a better response, would you say, if someone, says, I've been diagnosed with autism, or I think I may have autism diagnosis, coming, or something like this, or I'm wondering about that question. So an unhelpful response is say, well, we're all on the spectrum after all. You've described that. What's a better response?
Feels to me that it's the same response, I guess, to almost anything, that loving, open curiosity, I guess, which I must say I was met with, when I was having very similar conversations with people, either prior to having the diagnosis and then afterwards. I would say, to a very large extent, the response I got was that. But whatever that exploration is, I think that would for the most part be the most helpful, loving way to respond. So the kind of responses I remember having were things like, oh, okay, why are you thinking that? Just genuine curiosity. And of course, so much of that's not in the words, it's in the feeling. You could ask that from a place of like doubt and kind of questioning, or you could be asking it from a place of genuine, again, loving curiosity. And that's so much more about the relationship and where the person's coming from than it is the words being said. But really, I think that's what I possibly had a little bit of, and nothing major, were people almost wanting to almost save me from it. And this was about, I think this shows up more for other people I've heard, but it wasn't a major factor. But I definitely had a sense of some people wanting me almost to like make me feel better about it, either like, I would never have thought that, or, oh my goodness, like, that really surprises me. You don't come across like you're autistic, like there is a known way to come across being autistic. Again, that wasn't a major experience I had, but I definitely think that can be the response too. A kind of denial and a dismissal of it. And again, I think very well intentioned, but doesn't feel great to receive.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, I'm reminded of how people sometimes act in times of grief. And there's a phenomenon that's been observed. Well, there's been a phenomenon that's been observed, I think, in people who are working in grief counseling and so on and so forth, that when someone's grieving, sometimes the attempts to comfort that grieving person are sort of unhelpful, and they come, partly from empathy, an attempt to make it okay for the person. But of course, the grieving has to take its process. Making the grief go away in that moment sometimes isn't so helpful, but sometimes it can come from the person doing the comforting feels uncomfortable themselves, and wants to, perhaps unconsciously wants to, make it okay, make it go away. And so people, it's often reported, say very strange things about the deceased, or do very strange things to comfort a grieving person that sometimes are a little unhelpful, and force the grieving person to sort of put their grief aside and actually, in a way, handle or deal with or tend to the person who's comforting, and pull themselves together so as not to inconvenience, or so as not to disturb the person who's comforting them. It could be an interesting dynamic. And what you're talking about of open curiosity, and I think it's a very interesting theme. So I'm curious about Jonathan's ability to pinpoint or suggest this to you. How was he able to do that? Did he list a few things that he had observed, or he seems to have a good track record, at least in the two people you've mentioned so far? What's behind that?
He's done it more than us two as well. That was just the first one that for me was like, okay, there's evidence now. So this is actually a really interesting question that goes much sort of deeper perhaps than what we might call neurodivergence. And it's an investigation that Jonathan and I have been in for years in our understanding of people, their gifts, what they're here for, and magic, and started to see there were these links that were becoming clear between different kinds of neurodivergences and different, what you could call it, like magical abilities or gifts or ways of seeing and experiencing the world that were beyond the kind of usual mundane way that we might call typical. And this is getting into the realms of, sounds super woo, but I'm just going to say it because otherwise there's no point trying and have the whole conversation on a mundane level, because it just won't make sense. But we joke that Jonathan in a past life was some form of witch hunter. And so he was able to do that. I don't know if you've ever watched the series Witcher, where there's almost like an attunement to magic in others, differences in others. And so in his past life as a witch hunter, that was used for ill, like there's a witch, go get them. And his kind of penance for that, his karma, is to now come back and use this for good. So he has this just incredible ability to spot those gifts in others. And sometimes he might do that through an archetypal lens. Sometimes he might do it from a kind of naming it as neurodivergent. But his track record of that has just been uncanny. Again, I was very skeptical of that in the early years, both when it applied to me, but also when you'd say it about other people. But then over time, I've really started to recognize, no, that is a gift and it is working as it seems to be, even though I don't really like it. And so this again goes to a deeper pattern that, again, I'm still really trying to make sense of. But talking personally, I can now see that the differences in how I'm wired, that you could call a neurodivergence, are also what makes me naturally more able to go into, I guess, like what you could call altered states, for example. As you know, I'm training in shamanism, and that was something I did really reluctantly. It wasn't something I actually wanted to do at a human level. It was very much a kind of calling. And the more I'm on that path, the more I'm recognizing, like, my goodness, it's like I've been wired so specifically to be able to do these things, to go into an altered state, to be able to visualize things, to be able to see energy patterns that serve me really well in that work, even though I didn't ever actually want to do that work. And even though I had no understanding, I chose into shamanism before I had the autism diagnosis. And so then it was just like, oh my goodness, this now all makes complete sense. So again, going back to your original question about Jonathan, it seems to me that it isn't really that he's spotting the neurodivergence, it's he's spotting those, what you could call magical gifts in others. And it's just like in our modern culture, we have words for them like autism, but there is something deeper at play.
I see. Very interesting. And you mentioned that you initially, when he suggested that to you, you didn't agree. I'm wondering what your response was. You seem to imply you didn't have a particularly emotional response. about that. You said you weren't offended by it. I'm wondering how you received that suggestion. For example, I know that the suggestion of I think you might be X or I think you might be Y can sometimes feel threatening. It's funny you should mention this archetype of the witch hunter and so on. But of course, that wasn't how it was received. This wasn't how you received it. And so I'm curious about that. Can you explain a little about that? I'm wondering, for example, if someone might be thinking, I think somebody I know may be on the autistic spectrum, for example. Would you suggest a person like that mentions it to them, or how does that side of things work?
That's a great question. And when I say I had no emotional response, it probably isn't accurate. I think it wasn't so much that I had a negative connotation about autism particularly. I think at the time, actually, he probably languaged it Asperger's, because that was more at that point how we'd name that form of autism, let's say, which is a whole conversation itself that probably isn't worth getting into. So I don't think I had a particularly kind of negative view of autism, in that I was just kind of like, how dare you, I don't want to be that. I think it was probably a bit more like, how dare you think you know something about me that I don't know about myself. There was probably a bit of ego in that, I'm not having that, you thinking this about me when it's not true and I know me better than you. There was probably a bit of that. But there definitely was a bit around, and this has shown up with other people when I've had conversations with them, where when there's this stereotype of autistic people lacking social skills, being unable to create relationships, it can sound as though someone suggesting you're autistic is code for you're absolutely crap at relationships, conversation, social convention. So I think there is a bit of, it could be other things, but that particularly was for me. It's just like, is that what he's saying? So there definitely was, and again, it wasn't major, but I think there was a bit of that for me, like, is that what's being said? And so I suspect, and I'm not generally someone who takes offense. I don't tend to be kind of like an offended kind of archetype, if that makes sense. I tend to be more like curious, like, why would that be being said? But I would say in general, that's likely to be how many people would receive a question like that. Have you considered that you're autistic? I suspect many would consider it as like being asked something that is negative about them. Of course, again, this is so much about the relationship, the energy that's being kind of activated in that moment when the question is being asked. So of course there could be ways of having that conversation, but I think just being aware that how it could be received would allow for a more connecting conversation.
Perhaps it shows then what you're saying, the importance of education about these things, for people to really understand, say something like autism. It seems a lot of the misunderstandings are coming from, the miscommunications are coming from misunderstandings and the reputation of this or the reputation of that. Yeah, very interesting indeed. You mentioned that certain ways, I think you said the phrase, autism tends to express in women. Or show up in women, I think you said. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that, that particular theme, perhaps in reference to your own experience, or even more broadly.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is a really important question, because in where I am now, I feel like, everyone knows this. How kind of once you're in your own bubble, you just think this is normal for people to know that it shows up quite differently, but it really isn't out there. There's still, I suspect, many, many women who are struggling and not aware of why they're struggling, which, we can get into more about why it might be helpful, but I think there is still a huge misunderstanding in our collective around neurodivergence in women, and then particularly autism in women. So there was, and again, this is slightly controversial, so I'm not saying like this is true, but I think it is potentially a kind of helpful lens on this. You know, well, you may not know, but you know Sacha Baron Cohen, the Ali G actor. I think his cousin is a very well-known professor, I think, in autism. And he has a view which is autism is almost like an extreme male brain. The way that it processes is a kind of extreme version of differences you see between a male and female brain. And so he's sort of done various tests that shows it's kind of like you could call it a kind of extreme systems thinker. And again, there's controversy around that as well, which probably just take too long to go into. But I do think there is something in there that's helpful, as long as we don't kind of hold it too tight. And so hence, when we're looking again, if we look at the kind of like extreme and the stereotype of male autism, it'll often express in ways that are like extreme system thinking. And so often that can be, and again, all of these things are stereotypes and they're huge generalizations, but, you know, things like wanting to categorize types of trains or cars or things like that, you know, grouping information, processing things in that way. I would say that's still true for women on the spectrum. Certainly it's true for me. My mind is constantly looking at systems and underlying patterns and the first principles of things. One of the big differences is the kinds of things that we're drawn to categorize and systemize can then appear very different, almost like that's not what's happening. And so often for women, there'll be a kind of intense obsessions around things like animals, relationships, a kind of fantasy worlds that are kind of normal for, you know, many people, many girls growing up, many women, but it's like the level of intensity is deeper. But because it doesn't seem unusual, it's going unnoticed. There's another thing that's also very important, that is why this goes so under the radar, because women generally are more inclined and potentially actually just better at, how could you say it, doing what's pleasing, doing what's needed to be accepted and to create connections. Autistic women, whilst they might struggle a lot more than a neurotypical woman, they are still likely to be more adept at that and also more desiring of that than an autistic man. And so they are intensely, and I'm talking personally here too, have a lot of focus on how do I appear normal? How do I do the things, say the things that will have me perceived as everyone else? And so there can be a much greater kind of prizing of seeming normal, but also a greater ability to seem normal. What else would I say would be, I would say also there is, and this, again, we could get into a whole another conversation about differences between men and women, masculine, feminine things, but my own experience and also my experience of other autistic people is autistic women seem to have actually, I'll start at a different place. So one of the features of autism is ability to dissociate. So this is a human thing, but with autistic people, there can be like a hyper ability to dissociate, which can be really beneficial, and it's part of being able to hyper focus, as in nothing else exists apart from the thing I'm focusing on. Of course, that can also be used in ways that aren't so serving. So, for example, in order to just be able to like fit into this world, as an autistic person, I've kind of almost needed to dissociate from my environment to be able to kind of stay regulated. Things like bright lights, certain kind of noises, I received in my system as like extremely stressful. And so I've needed to dissociate to be able to just stay regulated and stay in that place. What I have noticed is that can be, this goes back again to the kind of whole shamanism thing, that ability to dissociate. And I think this again is probably true for everyone, but I think particularly for women, can be used as a portal into altered states of consciousness. And I see that happening naturally more with autistic women than I do with men. And I think it is probably a shared thing, but I think that kind of like dreaminess, operating almost like in this kind of other world, often is the case much more, I notice, with autistic women. So it can just look like they're a bit spacey and a bit kind of daydreamy, but I think it is more the autism that's creating that.
That's very interesting. I'd like to ask you actually a bit about the process of diagnosis, but perhaps before that, you mentioned a prizing of seeming normal and therefore a greater ability to seem normal. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, perhaps with an example or two, to put some flesh on the bone of that particular point.
Yeah. I think for me, it happened a bit later than perhaps it is average, in that my father, whilst he wasn't diagnosed, in hindsight, it was very clear that he was autistic too. And I'd been raised in a way where it was completely okay to be different. There wasn't really any directive from him for me to fit in, be normal, be acceptable, be pleasing. It very much was encouraged to just be myself. And so for varying reasons, some of the time I just wasn't in school because we were traveling, or just, by, I don't know, just fate, I was kind of able to be quite quirky and be quite different, but still be accepted right up until, I'd say, maybe the first year of secondary school. So when I was kind of 11 or 12. And I don't think it even really dawned on me initially. I think initially I still thought it's completely okay just to be me. And it really took me being bullied to then start to realize, like, oh, there's a way to be, and it's not this way. That's when it started to really dawn on me, like, I'm missing something. There's something they're all doing that's having them not be bullied. And I need to figure out what that is. And of course, again, because of the way that an autistic mind is wired, there will be this kind of, again, this like hyper focus on, like, what is it? Like, what am I missing? What are the patterns? How do I then do that thing? And then I guess I really just like went to work building the kind of girl that would be able to fit in, not be bullied, all of those things. And so for me, there was a kind of a profound transformation from being myself to being this version of me that I thought would allow me to stay safe. And I think it probably took, many years to kind of master a good enough mask to keep me kind of, like, okay, this now works. And there was a kind of, I think, hitting the world of work. It was like, okay, I now need to kind of construct another version of this, because the one I constructed for school doesn't quite work here. So I would say for probably up until about 25, a lot of my focus was going on, like, okay, what do I need to do to be pleasing? What do I need to do to be normal? What do I need to do to fit in? And of course, you don't really know what's going on for other people. So there was part of me that thought there is something different about me, because I don't think everyone else is doing this. But of course, I don't know. It might be the same things going on for everyone else too. But that was very much, a big focus. And then I think it was kind of on autopilot for some years after that. That just became a way of being, and I wasn't even really that aware that it was a mask anymore. It just was me. And I know from conversations I've had with other autistic women, that experience, they may have had training much earlier than I did, in terms of, like, their parents were from a very young age saying, this is how to be, this is how to be. So perhaps wasn't such a stark before and after, but my experience was very clear, like, it's okay to be me. It really isn't okay to be me.
Wow, that's very interesting. I'm wondering if we were to go back to that time in school and you started to do this hyper-focused analysis on what it was, as you put it, that they're doing that that I'm not even seeing really at the beginning, I suppose. And you started to build this different version of yourself. What were the key components? What did you begin to identify and then put in place that made up this new persona?
It's funny thinking back to I feel quite a lot of emotion rising now, actually. It was on so many levels. On a kind of material level, it was the very things to do with how I looked. Until that point, it wasn't even in my awareness that was an important thing. I spent a lot of my time outside with horses or other animals. I was very much a wild child and just had a really deep connection with nature and animals in particular. And I just didn't know that it was important to other people that you looked a certain way. It just wasn't even in my awareness as a thing. So there was a real kind of like, oh, like that matters to people. You're meant to look a certain way. So that was a big part of just constructing a kind of visual version of me that would be accepted. And of course, then you get into the whole, teenage hormones. I was quite a late bloomer in terms of, just developing into a woman, but also actually having kind of, a sense of even wanting interactions with boys in a certain way. So all of that kind of came quite late for me, where I was almost just having to figure it out, like, oh, okay, that you're meant to look like this, which probably for other girls at the time was more about attracting the interest of boys, but I wasn't even aware of that being a thing yet. When that became a thing, I was just like, oh my goodness, okay, double down. It needs to really look like this now. And then on an emotional level, there was a particular experience I had, which I think is a sort of standout experience, but I think it's a metaphor in a way for a pattern that was actually happening a lot. I wrote a poem in my English class. I think it was a homework we'd been given to write a poem about something, and I chose to write a poem about my classmates, and every line was a kind of expression of it's funny because I've told this story before without so much emotion. I'm not quite sure why I'm experiencing it with so much emotion at the moment, but each line of the poem was very much an expression of appreciation of their gifts, their beauty, who they were. And my teacher loved it so much, she asked me to stand and read it to the class. And I was so happy to do that. I just didn't have that filter of like, what's cool, what's not cool. I was really happy to be very expressed. I was very confident. And so I stood up in class and read this poem out. And as I was doing it, I started to, I was expecting them to receive it with just all the love that was in my heart for them. And as I think I probably got partway through reading and was like looking up and thinking, what's going on? That I can feel that they're not receiving what I'm transmitting. And I think I probably blocked out actually the things that were said, but in short, afterward, like during and then afterwards, it was very clear that wasn't acceptable. They weren't appreciating it. It meant something about me that wasn't okay. And I don't think I even quite understood what it was. And so I probably clamped down on like so many other aspects of my expression, just in case I did that again. But in short, there was I was extremely open-hearted, like very expressive, very appreciative of, everything around me. And there was this just like, that isn't okay. That's super uncool, super awkward. None of that anymore. Thank you very much. I'm just trying to think if there's another example of how I built a different girl. I think the other example, and I think this was able to kind of stay present to more of an extent than the other aspects of me, but I've always had, and again, it's a very autistic trait, like a very obsessive way about me, like whatever I'm interested in at the time becomes like a hyper focus, and I will go, as you know, super deeper into it, learn everything there is to know about it, and want to talk about it constantly as well, think about it constantly. And that, I guess, was one of the things that I could see other people weren't appreciating. You know, there was just clearly not an interest in that, but also it's not so much about that. It was more the fact that it's also not normal to have that hyper focus on things. So whilst I couldn't stop the hyper focus because it was just compels me too much, there definitely was, and potentially even now to an extent, a kind of a closing of my expression of the things that were going on for me. I would make sure that I wasn't talking too much about the things or giving clues that I was hyper obsessed about something. So I think there's probably more too, but they're probably the three biggest ways.
That's, yeah, very fascinating. Thank you for that. And when you had to make an adjustment for the place of work, I'm wondering if you can remember, and if it's interesting to talk about, what adjustments you found you had to make when you hit the workplace.
There's a couple of examples, and they are quite humorous, actually. So one of them is whilst I was at college, I had a part-time job in a local theatre behind their bar stroke snack bar for interval drinks and stuff. And I was first of all put on the sort of snack bar where we did like teas and coffees and chocolate and stuff. And I would take things so literally that I couldn't operate outside of that kind of literal, this is how we do something. Like, oh, great, there's a system, brilliant, I can get on board with a system, I do that. And then nuances to that just wouldn't enter my awareness. So if, for example, this is literally what one of the things I did, they'd say, oh, so if we're getting low or we're out of a particular type of chocolate bar, we need to fill it up. You know, we can't have a gap there or a low stock there. So as soon as something's out there, we need to then fill it up with a thing. And so brilliant, I can do that. But I would do that even if we had customers waiting. So the customer would be there waiting, like, you know, busy interval thing, everyone's queuing up, me, oh, we're out of Whispers or whatever, I need to now restock the Whispers, whilst everyone said, like, what the hell is she doing, why is she but that wouldn't be obvious to me until it was played back to me. That particular job I ended up getting the sack from for, they thought, smoking cannabis in the loos. I have actually never taken any illegal drugs in my whole life, and certainly not then, and I certainly wasn't smoking cannabis in the loos. But I think I was just so away with the fairies. I think it was the only, like, they thought it's the only thing that explains it, I guess, because it's so out there. I don't think they would just come up with it as an excuse. They must have genuinely believed that was the case. So there was just, it seems to me a lot of, again, like whole new rules and things to understand about the way that people worked that hadn't been visible to me at school. I guess school by its nature has, it's like a smaller world. It's a much easier to learn the rules and the systems of the school world compared to the world of work, and particularly when it's a new job. So that was, again, a real, and then I think for probably the first few jobs I had, it was a similar kind of like rude awakening where I'd like find myself doing things thinking, I'm like, look at me, I can do this system perfectly. And then it turns out doing the system perfectly is the wrong thing to do, which is as confusing as hell to someone that's kind of like, but you asked me to do this thing. So yeah, I can give more examples, but I hope it answers the question.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I think we're coming near the end of our recording time by the looks of it. Of course, I've so many more questions based on what you said. It's been so fascinating. Could we talk a bit about the diagnosis, that process? So Jonathan's pointed it out to you, suggested that to you, and then he's done the same, or he's made the similar observation in this client of yours who went on to be diagnosed. Can you talk about then what were the next steps for you? How did you seek out diagnosis? What was that process like? And what has been the consequence for you of receiving that diagnosis?
Yeah, I'm really glad to be talking about this, because I do think it's not for everyone. And so I'm by no means saying anyone that thinks they could be neurodivergent or autistic should run out and get a diagnosis. I think it's a very personal thing. For me, this in itself, I think, is quite an autistic trait. I just wanted to know, I didn't feel, whilst I was in this, like, am I, aren't I didn't feel able to then, and not to say this is the right way, it's just for me personally, I didn't feel able to kind of then say I might be autistic. So I wasn't saying it at all. And I was starting to think there could be some benefits in being able to know and therefore speak from that place. And because I need it to be definite, I won't be able to do that until I have a diagnosis. So that was the reason for me personally, where I just needed the certainty. And the reason that felt important was much less for me a personal thing, in terms of, I have my life pretty much how I want it. I have worked for years to create a life that works really, really well for me. There is not, I'm not employed by anyone that I need to kind of ask for a particular setup. Everyone that's in relationship with me, kind of like, I have a relationship that works on the terms that we've created it. There wasn't really a sense for me personally, and I think it's quite different to most, there wasn't really a personal sense of like, oh, at least if I can say I'm autistic, I can then ask for these adjustments. Like, there really wasn't that for me. For me, it was much more about, I guess, like, yeah, it would be useful to know. There was also I had a sense that a close family member might also be autistic. And there was a kind of sense of like, well, if I went first, that would ease that journey. But more importantly than all of that, it was, if I am, this is something that would be really helpful for me to speak about publicly in service of others, so that other people can hear that, firstly, it doesn't have to be a negative thing. And it's something that could actually be helpful for them to know about themselves. It could be something that they then want to go on and have a diagnosis, which actually I know, lots of people, having been public about my diagnosis, have gone on to do exactly that. So it was much more a sense of, this feels as though it's being put into my awareness for a reason way beyond me as a person. And it's something to do with why I'm here and what I have to offer to the world. And for that reason, it would be really helpful for me to have the diagnosis. Do you want to ask me anything about that, or because there's more I can say about the diagnosis, which is checking before I carry on. Is there anything you want to ask me about that part?
No, I think that's very clear. Yeah. These are the various motivations you had for seeking out a diagnosis. So now I'm very curious how you went about that process. What steps did you take to get assessed, and etc. from there?
So, and again, I think that it is really important to recognize, like, I don't think my reasons for seeking diagnosis are like at all typical. I think for most people, it's going to be much more of a personal thing, as in like about their own personal experience. And that can be a really good reason for doing so, particularly again, if you're employed by someone and you might need adjustments, that can be a really good reason to have a diagnosis. So I had, I think after I heard about the client having the diagnosis, it was just like, this is now feeling like it probably is something I could take a bit more seriously. Had a conversation with my sister about it. and was saying, this is where I am. I'm wondering whether to go for a diagnosis, and just had a kind of chat with her about it. And then about 3 days later, she messaged me and went, look at this. And a mutual friend had just been diagnosed with autism. I don't think we've ever had a mutual friend diagnosed with autism, like ever before. And it was like 3 days after we'd had the conversation. And I was just like, okay, well, that isn't a sign. I don't know what is. So I then got in contact with him and just said, basically shared the whole story that had like led to me reaching out. And he very generously shared his experience, how he'd got to the point of having the diagnosis. And I said, would you recommend who you had the diagnosis with? And he did. And so there is definitely a route. You know, if you're in the UK, we have the NHS, and that is a route, but it can take time. And I was in the position where I have the resources to just go for it, and it felt like the right thing to do in this particular, again, the way that happened with that person having the diagnosis and recommending the person, I was like, okay, that's clearly the route to go. So it was with and there's also a question whether you have what's called a clinical diagnosis, which is with a psychiatrist, or a non-clinical one, which is via a kind of other experts in the field, but it's not a clinical diagnosis. And depending on the kind of diagnosis you might need for however you're going to use it, that can be an important thing. It wasn't for me, again, it just happened to be with a psychiatrist because that's who's recommended, which means I have a clinical diagnosis, but it's not really that important to me, it just happened to be that way. So it all then happened really quickly and smoothly. I mean, I had then had this whole imposter syndrome of like, oh my God, what if I'm not autistic? And I go down this route, and then at the end of it, I'm told I'm not autistic. That's just going to be so embarrassing and like awkward. And just like, it was so funny how getting into this, like now, like I really want to be diagnosed as autistic, because it's just going to be so cringy not to be. It's so funny, isn't it? The way the human mind will like react to different things like this. So, the process involved, I think this is broadly the same with most diagnoses, no matter who you have it with. I was asked to do 2 tests, which involved kind of answering questions, and then had an interview, just me and the psychiatrist. And then also had to kind of provide lots of information about my past experiences. They typically then like to interview someone who's known you from childhood, like ideally a caregiver, like a parent, but because both my parents are dead, and I actually don't really know anyone who knew me as a child, my sister and husband kind of acted as the references, as it were. And at the end of, I don't think this is typical, but I don't know if it was just like, I'm so autistic, it was just like, whatever, I may as well tell her. But at the end of that second interview, he was kind of running through the next steps. And I just said, are you able to tell me now, you know, what your diagnosis will be? And he said, yes, he said, from everything I've seen. And he also, I'd scored very highly on the tests as well, highly in terms of autistic. And he said, I'll be making the diagnosis of autism. And I just burst into tears. It was such a funny, like, it was one of those moments of like, it was shock, relief, but almost like euphoria. I remember describing it as like winning the world's weirdest lottery. Like I felt this real sense of like, just like, oh my goodness, this is the best news ever. But while simultaneously being like, my world has just like completely changed. So it definitely took, and I think again from other autistic people I've heard having had diagnosis, can take a while to be with it. You know, even if you've had a strong sense that you are, it does feel like it's kind of like, okay, this is getting to know myself again through this lens, and seeing all these experiences I had now through this lens. It now explains why I had these struggles, why I behaved like this, why this relationship went this way. So there was a period, which I guess to an extent is now a year on, I think, since that diagnosis. And I think even now, I still am noticing like, oh, wow. Yeah, I can see now why that happened the way it did. It was because of being autistic. So it's been, for me, a really interesting journey, and largely completely positive. Like for me, it really has been like a recognition of aspects of myself that I hadn't known through that lens. And again, going back to the reason I had the diagnosis, it absolutely has given me the opportunity to use it for good.
Mm-hmm. Well, fascinating. I'm wondering if there's something that I haven't asked that I should, or something that we haven't talked about that we should, about this subject and your experiences.
Yeah, I love that you've asked that. What occurs to me is why we might even have neurodivergence. Why is this even a thing? Why are people neurodivergent? Why are people autistic? If you care to ask me that.
Well, I think, yes, let's do it. I mean, this is part of the conversation, so certainly. I think that's a very interesting question. What do you think is the answer to that?
My sense is, and this goes back to what I was touching on when you asked me the question about Jonathan's kind of superpower to spot autistic people. It seems to me that we need people to be all different shapes and sizes. We need people to be wired in all different kinds of ways. And we particularly do need people, and I think more now than ever, who are able to see the world differently, are able to, I guess, look at things maybe more at that kind of, again, systems level, like what's really happening here, what's happening energetically, what does this mean for our future? And then again, talking specifically about that link that we're seeing between neurodivergence and kind of more magical gifts. If we go back to, pretty much any indigenous culture that we've studied, there almost always will be a shaman, a medicine woman, a medicine man, a healer. And why wouldn't we need those people now? And it feels to me we probably need those people more than ever because of how disconnected we are, how out of alignment with nature, with ourselves, with spirit we are. And again, this is a premise I'm operating under, if it turns out that people with neurodivergences are more able to naturally inhabit that role, that makes sense to me, that we need people who are inhabiting that role. And therefore, why wouldn't we have evolved to have certain people who are wired in a way to perform that? I'll add one more piece to this, which I think you and I have, I think I've mentioned this to you before. So these theories were things, again, that Jonathan and I had been talking about for many years, way before my diagnosis. And then the order of things happening was that I finally submitted to this call of shamanism with great reluctance. And then several months after that, I was diagnosed with autism. And then I think literally a week after my diagnosis, like really soon afterwards, I came across a study that showed that autistic people look to have a kind of hypermetabolism of natural DMT in their minds. And so, and it's various forms of DMT as well. So, how different plant medicines have different forms of DMT. There's several different types of DMT that have been found at higher rates in the minds and also brains rather, and urine of autistic people, which seems to me to support this idea that if we see DMT as that spirit molecule, that ability to kind of open up to other realms, it would kind of make sense that if autistic people are here to be the shamans, they would naturally have a leaning to that being more open to spirit anyway. And potentially also then, if they are going to work with plant medicines, it be something their minds are already wired more towards. So it really feels to me, and again, all of this is, it's not like I've got, great raft of, scientific research to back any of this up. These are theories that we've been working with and exploring and starting to kind of join the dots between. But going back to that kind of like, why would we have these neurodivergences? It feels to me like it's because we need them. It's no accident. We need them.
Very interesting. Thank you, Lian, for sharing your experiences and your journey with this today. It's been very, very fascinating indeed.
Thank you. It does really. I think I just accepted at some point, like, hey, you're interviewing me, but I feel so grateful for this. I feel we've had a conversation that I probably wouldn't have had in other circumstances, and I actually feel really glad to have been able to talk about it in this way. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Well, it feels a bit odd at the end of this conversation to say this, but maybe it's not, maybe it's the opposite. Where can people find out more about you, Steve, and the wonderful work that you do?
Yeah, well, of course, guruviking.com is my website, Guru Viking, GURUVIKING.com. And my podcast is everywhere where podcasts are, including YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and so on. Yeah, I mean, that's the place. Maybe, are there any resources you want to share now, actually, given the topic? Because as you say, it's a little bit incongruous to put my website now. Of course, why not? That's where people can find me. That's fine. But are there any resources that you want to share, or anything you want to make sure is included at this point?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So what occurs to me is, and I'll make sure all these links are in the show notes too, but I did an episode with Lucy Pierce, who is an incredible author and is also an autistic woman. She and I did an episode last year that if listeners haven't heard that, they'll find that a really good kind of next step to listen to. I've also done a whole series of videos and a little bit of writing on different magical archetypes. And so if someone's listened to this and heard aspects of themselves in what I've described and are then thinking like, wow, what could that mean in terms of it actually being a gift? That would be a really good resource to go look at, because I've spoken about my experience with different magical archetypes like the priestess, the shaman, the witch, and the different traits that I've seen show up in each. And so that could be a really interesting kind of like more magical. There's the kind of look at it through the neurodivergent lens. And also on that podcast with Lucy, she has listed a whole bunch of resources on her blog that are linked from that episode. But if you then want to look at it more from the magical lens, that magical archetypes resource would be a really good next step. So thank you for asking me that, Steve.
Okay.
I so appreciate you. Thank you very much.